All right, so we'll get started. So good morning. So what we're going to do is we're going to talk today about, we'll review a few things, but what we're going to talk about is also how to kind of break that cycle of insulin resistance, as well as a few other topics, particularly sugars and also wheat, which are quite important as they're really a large part of our diets. What we're talking about first is we're going to talk about sugars. In sugars, there's several different types of sugars you may or may not know. There's the regular glucose, which is the blood sugar, and that's this one. There's also fructose, which is actually a slightly different form of sugar. And when you combine the two, you get regular sugar, regular sucrose, which is one glucose and one fructose. When you string all these sugars together, what you get is something called a carbohydrate. So whenever they talk about carbohydrates, simple carbohydrates are one or two sugars linked together, like sucrose. And if you have longer carbohydrates, like strings of carbohydrates, long strings, they call them complex carbohydrates. So these are things like wheat and so on. And really, until about the 19th century, they were really quite rare. Nobody really ate a lot of sugar. But then once they started to get these sugar plantations, then the consumption of sugar really started to take off. And one of the things that's important is that the explorers, the Magellans and the Columbus and so on, they would actually carry enormous quantities of these carbohydrates, which is the sugars and the wheat, because they didn't spoil, right? You could keep them in your pantry and they don't spoil, so they would keep them around, and that's why they would eat enormous quantities of this. And so by the early 1900s, what happened was that the amount of sugar that people were consuming started to skyrocket. It went from very little to over 90 pounds a year. And if you look at how much sugar people eat, this is a general idea of how much they eat. So this actually excludes fructose, so that's why North America looks a little bit lower than usual. But what you can see is that the lowest consumption is really in Asia as well as Africa. But in fact, that's actually the areas where they're actually eating the most. So they're rising quicker than the rest. So even though Europe and North America and so on are much higher in terms of sugar consumption, where you see the greatest rise in sugar consumption is actually in Asia and Africa. And that's actually the same places where you actually see the largest rises in obesity as well. The problem with sugars in general, so fructose, glucose, as well as sucrose, which is regular sugar, is that it's often hidden. And it's often hidden in the foods that we eat. So even though you might not think you're getting a lot of sugar, you actually are whenever you eat a lot of processed foods. So the fructose, they put that high fructose corn syrup, they put it in a lot of processed foods. So things you might not think about, like bread and hot dogs and pizza and crackers and soups, there's actually a lot of sugar contained within those foods. The other place where you find a lot of sugar is in beverages. And if you look at sugar-sweetened beverages, those are, basically soda pop as well as a lot of fruit juices. You can see that I'll actually show you on here. If you look at this is children and this is adults, and what you see is that the sugar-sweetened beverages really starts to skyrocket somewhere starting in the 1960s. Earlier than that, you see that people would be drinking a lot of milk, but milk consumption has been slowly going down. Since about 2000, though, with the realization that sugars were really not very good for you, a lot of the consumption has actually started to go down since about the year 2000, which is actually a very hopeful sign. And one of the problems, of course, is that the serving sizes has actually gone up. If you actually go back to the original McDonald's, you can see how pitifully small it actually looks compared to what we're drinking today. These are the large gulps and the big gulps and the large thing. So the problem, of course, is that the serving size has actually substantially increased from about 7 ounces to almost, some of these big ones, some of these are like almost 10 times the size of these. I mean, even if you compare the regular drink in 1955 to a kid's drink now. It's almost half the size. So you can see that people are actually drinking a lot more of these sugar-sweetened beverages over the years. Like I said, it has tailed off a little bit in recent years. And there's clearly a correlation between the amount of sugar you eat and obesity. And I think everybody has started to realize that, or it has been fairly obvious. And there's a number of studies to look at that. I mean, if you look at juice and kids, so for many years people would tell kids to drink apple juice or orange juice, thinking it's really good for you. But in fact, what you see is that the more number of servings of juice a day that you drink, the higher the chance of obesity. And this was not true for whole fruits. So the more whole fruits that people drink, there was no correlation with obesity. But with the kids anyway, the more servings of fruit juice that you took, the higher the chance of your obesity. And if you look at adults, so this is a large study, the Nurses' Health Study, of 50,000 women. What you can see is that these are the amount of sugar-sweetened beverages that they take. So whether you take less than one a week or greater than one a day, if it's a consistent, you generally gain a little bit more weight, but not a lot, about 2 kilograms. But look what happens when you go from drinking very little, like less than one a week, to more than one a day. You can see that those people who change their habits and start to drink a lot of sugar-sweetened beverages, their rate of weight gain actually goes up quite a bit, up to 4.2 kilograms per year. And those who go the other way, that is, if you cut out all your sugared sweetened beverages, that is your iced teas and your pops and so on, you can see that they actually start to, they don't lose weight, but they don't gain weight either. So making that change seems to be very important for weight gain. And really, the more you drink, clearly the higher your risk of diabetes. So if you drink less than one per month to more than one per day, you can see your risk is substantially increased. So 1.83 means that there's an 83% increased risk of developing diabetes with the highest with the highest number of sugar sweetened beverages compared to if you rarely drink these sugar sweetened beverages. So if you think about what we've been talking about, which is the hormonal obesity theory, you can see that the main player in all of this is still going to be your increased insulin levels. But really, where do sugars fit in? Because there's a whole move to say that sugar is really toxic. But where do sugars really fit into this whole pathway? This is your main problem with the increased insulin levels, and this is what really drives the obesity. But as we talked about the last time, it's not simply the obesity that is driven, but actually all of this, the diabetes, the obesity, the high blood pressure, all of this metabolic syndrome, which is really risk factors for disease, all of that is driven by insulin. There are protective factors such as fiber, such as vinegar, which we talked about before, and insulin resistance is the key player. So insulin resistance causes a high insulin level. The high insulin level in turn causes more insulin resistance, and that goes over time. But where does sugars fit into this? We're not really sure yet. Are they simply one of the carbohydrates? Because it is a carbohydrate, and therefore it will lead to the increased insulin levels, or is there something else? The other thing, of course, is that fructose, which is from fruit. Fructose, where does that fit in? Because fructose does not actually lead to high blood glucose. So is it actually healthier for you? It's not really clear from there. So we know that carbohydrates, as opposed to proteins and fats, have the unique ability to really raise blood glucose. That is, if you increase the amount of carbohydrates, so these are a usual diet or a 55% carbohydrate diet, you can see, versus a 20% carbohydrate diet, you can see what happens to your blood sugars. Your blood sugars goes way up. And the low carbohydrate diet, the blood sugars don't go up so much, right? So with the proteins. But it's not simply about the glucose, because it's not the glucose which drives the obesity. It's the insulin which drives the obesity. So even though some of them are going to increase your blood glucose, that will drive the insulin levels, but high protein can also drive high insulin production as well. So is sugar simply manifesting as one of the carbohydrates? That's really the question. There are certain cofactors in terms of what makes us absorb things faster. So if you take a lot of fiber, for instance, you're going to slow the speed of the digestion. The speed of the digestion, such as processing, like polishing rice or refining things like wheat, mashing things, juicing things, they're going to increase the speed of the digestion. So that's going to raise how high your sugars go, which in turn drives the amount of insulin that you produce. So going back about, 30 years now, there was always a question of where fructose fits in, because fructose does not raise blood sugars. So, and it was a fruit, it was from fruit. So people said, wow, well, it's from fruit, so, and it doesn't raise your blood glucose, so it should be really, really healthy for you. About 30 years ago, we were in the full swing of this whole low-fat, idea, that the idea was that fat was really the problem. The dietary fat was really what was driving the obesity. So because these sugar is not fat, they said, well, then it's not so bad for you. And sucrose, because it contains one glucose and one fructose, doesn't raise the blood sugars quite as much as pure glucose. So they said, well, it's not bad. So in fact, in 1983, in the New England Journal of Medicine, they said, we see no reason for diabetics to be denied foods containing sucrose. In other words, even though your blood sugars are high, they're saying you could eat sugar, which doesn't really seem to make a lot of sense, but that was the conventional thinking. So this is the New England Journal, which is one of the most prestigious journals of its time. If you go to 1986, the Food and Drug Administration was saying that there is no conclusive evidence that sugars demonstrates a hazard. And this was, of course, the time that they're saying that the fat was the problem. So since it's low in fat, you could eat as much sugar as you want. And this is where we saw the really big rise in the consumption of sugar. So even in 2006, the American, so this is only, 6 or 7 years ago now, the American Diabetes Association says you can substitute sucrose for other carbohydrates. So that is, instead of eating whole wheat or whole grains, you could eat sugar. It's fine, right? Like, as ridiculous as that sounds, this was the American Diabetes Association. This is their position paper from 6 or 7 years ago, right? So this is what all your doctors and what I was taught. Sugar's not a bad thing. It's fine. You have diabetes, but you can eat sugar. As long as you're eating low fat, it's okay. That's what they're saying. So things, sugar-sweetened beverages such as Snapple, they call themselves all natural and they're not pops, and then, oh, they're really healthy for you. So people thought they're healthy for you and they drank them a lot. And you can see that from the fructose consumption. So fructose is that fruit sugar. You can see that the amount that we drank actually kind of exploded, especially if you look at adolescents in 1994. They were up to 72, 73, so they're actually well up here. But if you compare that to amount of fructose that you get from fruit, so pre-World War II, you're only talking about 20 grams per day of fructose. And that's kind of eating all the fruit that you want. And you can see we're well above those levels. We're at about 2 or 3 times those levels of fructose. So even though fructose, there's still a question of how good or bad it is for you, it's clearly also a matter of how much we take in. That is, we take in far more than we ever did. And that might be a problem. One of the major problems, of course, was the high fructose corn syrup. Now, you've probably heard of high fructose corn syrup. It's been vilified recently in the press. And what it is that they took corn and they processed that into this high fructose corn syrup. And the food processors loved this stuff, right? Because it had a huge number of advantages. So what it was 55% fructose. So normal sugar is 50%, and high fructose corn syrup goes 55%. So not actually all that different, but slightly higher. And the huge advantage was that it had a low glycemic index. So they were thinking, wow, maybe this is actually better for you than regular sugar. But in addition to that, the main thing was that it's cheaper and sweeter than glucose. So when you add this stuff, the food processors thought, oh, this is fantastic. One, you can say that it's not sugar. And two, you can use less of it because it's sweeter, and it's a lot cheaper. So they saved a lot of money. The other thing that it helps the breads brown, it prevents freezer burn, it mixes easily and helps keep the bread soft. So there's a lot of advantages. So soon the amount of high fructose corn syrup just kind of was everywhere. Everywhere that you wanted to look in processed foods, you found high fructose corn syrup. And that's the problem. Especially these low-fat foods, because the food processors were trying to sell stuff, right? So they'd stick a huge low-fat label on it. The problem is when you took out the fat, the food didn't taste so good. So what they had to do was they'd stuff it full of this high fructose corn syrup so that it would taste pretty reasonable. But so every time you saw a low-fat food, like low-fat yogurt, for instance, all they do is they'd stuff a little bit more sugar in it. And yes, there would be no fat, but there's a lot of sugar in it. And it would make up for the taste of it, and it'd still be tasty, and people would still buy it, right? And the other thing that was good was that it was cheap. And pretty soon people noticed that there is a clear correlation between the amount of high fructose corn syrup we were eating and the weight. So if you look at total fructose, so the amount of fructose as opposed to regular glucose that we are eating, it's been going up till about 2000, and then it kind of takes a bit of a downturn. But if you look at the obesity prevalence and the amount of high fructose corn syrup that we're eating, you can see that they actually look pretty similar, right? So this is the obesity, and this is total amount of fructose. They look pretty similar. So a lot of people saying, well, since it looks so similar, there's an association. Is that the real problem? And really, I don't think that was really so much the problem. I think that between high fructose corn syrup and sugar, they're actually fairly similar chemically. If you look at what happened was that the high fructose corn syrup was actually simply replacing the sugar. So you're just substituting one for the other. But since one was cheaper, they could put more into your foods. But I don't think that it was the high fructose corn syrup per se, but the total amount of sugars and sweeteners, you can see, was the problem. And what is the problem with fructose really? Because for about 20 years they said it was better for you because it didn't raise your blood sugars, right? So they would sweeten foods with fructose and it wouldn't raise your blood sugar. So they said, well, that's good. Well, the problem with fructose, and this has really been recognized within the last, say, 10 years when the tide kind of started to turn against high fructose corn syrup, is actually the way it's metabolized. So both sugar and high fructose corn syrup have a lot of this fructose. And it's metabolized differently than glucose. So glucose is actually used in the cells. So when you take glucose, your cells can actually directly metabolize it. But when you take fructose, they can't do that. It has to be metabolized through the liver here. And what happens is that it's actually independent of energy status. That is, you can take as much fructose as you want. The liver will keep on metabolizing it. So as you take fructose, it kind of gets broken down, but it gets broken down in the liver into these triglycerides, which is basically fat. So you get this lipogenesis, which is creation of fat, which is one of the major problems in terms of fatty liver. But the other thing it does is that it's much more likely to cause these advanced glycation end products, which might be really, really bad for you. But the other thing that's interesting is that it doesn't seem to suppress the appetite quite as much as the regular glucose does. So regular glucose doesn't get metabolized indefinitely. After a while, your body starts to say, okay, well, that's enough. But not so much with the fructose. That is, it can keep metabolizing and keep producing this fat as long as it wants. And that's a real problem. And that's one of the things, for instance, if you think about these, a big can of Coke or one of those big gulps of Coke or something, is that one of the things I used to wonder about is that, if you eat a meal, like you go to McDonald's, you get a Big Mac meal or whatever you did, it actually didn't matter whether you drank water or whether you drank Coke. You'd be kind of the same amount of fullness, right? You'd be about the same amount of fullness. But that big thing of Coke has 500 calories or 400 calories to it. But it didn't seem to satisfy you the same way. And a lot of people notice that, and it seems that it doesn't seem to stimulate the same sort of satiety mechanisms, that is the leptin and ghrelin, but it doesn't cause you to be full and can actually make you start to eat more. But the real problem with fructose is the effect on the liver, and it's the insulin resistance that's the real problem. Because if you think about the hormonal obesity theory, it's really the insulin resistance which causes the high insulin level. So even if fructose doesn't cause high sugars, If it causes insulin resistance, it's still going to play into that whole thing. And what you can do is, what they did was they took people and they gave them their usual diet, but plus they added another extra 1,000 calories of either glucose or fructose. And what you see is that you can measure their insulin tolerance test, which is a measure for diabetes. And you can see that their tests are actually 25% worse when you give them fructose. So the same amount of calories you're taking. So it's regular diet. Either you give them extra glucose or extra fructose. And what you see is that the people that you give the fructose to, you get worse diabetes. You get worse tolerance of your insulin, which means that you're getting insulin resistance, which is actually feeding directly into that mechanism. So if you take a similar experiment where they gave people fructose, so this is their usual diet, and then they gave them some extra fructose. They actually tried to measure fish oil. They also gave fish oil to see if it would help, but it didn't really help. And what you can see is that the endogenous glucose production, which is again a measure of this insulin resistance, when you started to overfeed these people fructose, you got insulin resistance. And this is the most recent paper in 2009. And what they did was a very similar experiment. But again, they gave people about 25% of their calories as fructose, pure fructose, or glucose. What they did was they took some Kool-Aid and they sweetened it either with glucose or they sweetened it with fructose. And you might think, well, 25% of your calories in a day is pretty high. That's actually not that. It's high, but it's not off the scales. A lot of, like the average American, would be somewhere around 10 to 15% of their calories as sugars in a day. But what you can see is that when you do an oral glucose tolerance test, which is a measure of diabetes, that is, it's something you can do right here in the lab, you can see that the fructose group actually has significantly worse insulin resistance than the glucose group. So again, even though it's the same number of calories, you're having some kind of effect on the liver which is causing this insulin resistance. And the problem with the insulin resistance is that it's going to cause a much higher level of insulin. So if you measure insulin levels with fructose ingestion, what you get is high insulin levels. So your sugars are not going up, but your insulin is going up. And this is the problem of insulin resistance. And this is only after 9 weeks. That is, you can take somebody who doesn't have diabetes, and after 9 weeks of giving them fructose, you can actually start to show that they're starting to get diabetes. That's pretty scary considering, this is only 9 weeks, and these are previously healthy people. So if you think about where fructose fits in, it's actually extra bad for you, because the sugars are not simply carbohydrates that cause your high sugars, high insulin levels, but the fructose actually directly leads to the insulin resistance. And insulin resistance is going to play into this vicious cycle. And this is what's going to cause high insulin levels, and of course insulin is going to be your main driver. So if you think that fructose is a problem, you should be able to see that there's a correlation between fructose and all these other problems with the metabolic syndrome. That is, you should be able to see a link between the amount of fructose you eat and the weight, the cholesterols, the blood pressure, the diabetes, and the fatty liver. And if you look closely, you actually can. So if you look at people who take, this is again, you're taking healthy people and you're giving them a lot of fructose, what you see is that their triglycerides increase almost 80%. So that's the amount of fat in the liver. Remember, the fructose gets metabolized to this triglycerides in the liver. But the amount of triglycerides significantly increases. Again, right away, after 1 month. And these are healthy people that don't have any problems. You give them excess amounts of fructose, and immediately you see this rise in triglycerides. If you look at the amount of sugar, so this is NHANES data, which is about 6,000 adults, which they did a general survey. And you can see the more sugar that you eat, so this is the percentage of energy from added sugar, the higher your triglycerides. The more sugar you take, the higher your triglycerides. The HDL, which is the good cholesterol, again, a good cholesterol, the higher it is, the better you are. You can see that this is, again, percentage of added sugars. As you take more and more of your calories as sugar, you can see there's a clear decrease in the amount of good cholesterol, which is bad for you. If you look at the where they're just taking healthy people and giving them fructose, again, your triglycerides goes up, your bad cholesterol goes up, and the good cholesterol doesn't do anything. Some of these other further measures are also made worse, which is the small, dense lipoproteins. You can also see the same effect with blood pressure. That is, if you take, this is the amount of, this is again NHANES data, which is a kind of general survey of the United States. And what you can see is that if you take the people who took high blood pressure, this is high blood pressure, there's a clear correlation between the amount of sugars that you take and blood pressure. So this is the odds ratio for high versus low fructose. So they're comparing a high fructose group to a low fructose group, and this is their blood pressure. So you see that there's a higher odds risk of blood pressure as you take more and more sugars. And if you, this is the Premier study, which is the about 810 adults. And what they did was they tried to lower their sugar sweetened beverages, because that's one of the major food groups that has sugar, is the beverages. And what you can see is that if you look at the tertiles, which is, so they break them into thirds. So this is the people who reduced their sugar sweetened beverages the least, versus those who reduced it the most. And you can see the people who reduced their sugar-sweetened beverages the most had the greatest drop in blood pressure versus the least. And you can see that's highly significant. And you can drop it quite a bit, 9.5 millimeters of mercury, which is, you know, going from 150, which is high blood pressure, to like 140, which is just kind of borderline, or 140 to 130. So that's a very significant amount of reduction of blood pressure simply by reducing its sugar-sweetened beverages. And again, if you look at fructose and fatty liver, again, the fat is produced in the liver, you can see that there's almost a 6 times increase in this de novo lipogenesis, which is basically fat in the liver, because as you take more of that fructose, again, it's going to be converted into fat, and what you get is the fatty liver, which actually goes along with all of those other things. And one of the real problems, not so much metabolically, but in the brain it does something funny too. For sure it does, because it seems that the sugars are addictive. That is, it's not simply a matter of the calories, but it seems that as you take more sugar, you're actually going to eat more. You should eat less, of course, because sugars have calories, and as you take calories, you're going to be less hungry, right? That's what normally happens, because if you eat meat, for instance, if you eat a piece of beef, the more you take, the less hungry you get, right? That's just natural. But look at this. If you look at the amount of sugar-sweetened beverages, you can see that those people who change, remember this is that big nurses' health study, where they looked at people who went from drinking less than 1 drink per week to more than 1 drink per day. So these people went from drinking very little juice and soda pops and stuff to drinking a lot. So this is the amount of extra calories they took. The black bar is the calories from the actual sugar-sweetened beverage, from the actual pop or whatever. So you see that it's actually higher than just the calories from the actual sugar-sweetened beverages. So that is, as you drink more and more of these sugar-sweetened beverages, the iced teas, the Coca-Colas and so on, you actually not only take the extra calories from those, you actually take more, because they make you more hungry. Right? And that's great for all these food companies that want to sell you more food. That's why they want you to take a big thing of Coke or a big thing of iced tea, because not only are you going to take those calories from the iced tea, you're going to eat a little bit more of the food as well, which is great for them. They want to sell you more food. If you go from drinking a lot of drinks to less drinks, you can see this is the amount of calories that has been reduced. And again, this black bar is the amount of calories from the actual sugar-sweetened beverages. So as you reduce your sugar-sweetened beverages, you not only reduce your calories from the sugar-sweetened beverages, you actually eat less, which means that they're addictive, right? Because they're actually making you want to eat. So they're having the opposite effect of most foods. That is, most foods, as you eat more, you get more full and eat less. But these ones, as you eat more, you want to eat more. So they're not only bad for you from a metabolic standpoint, because they're driving up your insulin and causing insulin resistance, they're actually driving you to eat more food. So in terms of the sugars, you can see that they're actually extra bad for you because they work on both sides, but they also tend to increase your foods. The other carbohydrate we're going to talk about is wheat, because that's really the major carbohydrate in the Western diet. So as opposed to, say, rice in the many Asian cultures, wheat is actually the major carbohydrate in Western culture. And there's actually been a change in what we eat in terms of the wheat, because everybody thinks, oh, we've been eating wheat for thousands of years. And that is true, but there actually has been a change. So if you look at this picture, you can see that this is the old wheat, the ancient wheat that people used to eat. And it's called einkorn wheat, and there's different varieties. But this is the modern durum wheat, and you can see that they actually look a little bit differently. And part of the problem was back in the 1950s and 60s, they worried about population explosion and people would be so hungry and you couldn't feed the world, so people would starve. So what they did was they actually changed the wheat. So they bred them. They didn't have gene splicing and stuff, so they just bred them, the wheat, to look differently. And what you can see is that the amount of the amount of the seed head actually increased, because that's what you eat, right? You don't want to grow more of the stalk part of it because the stalk is useless. You don't eat it. So you can see that the amount of the seed is actually significantly increased. And they just kind of hybridized these and hybridized these until they got something with a lot that looked like that. And in fact, it was considered the Green Revolution, and Dr. Borlaug was considered the father of the Green Revolution, and I just thought this was great, right? Because now, instead of getting a little bit of food, we get a lot of food. But one of the problems is that we actually don't really know whether this wheat is the same as the old wheat. Because the problem when you increase the head is that it'll fall over, right? So this is original wheat. So you can see that you have this long stalk, and if this is too heavy up at the top, it's just going to flop over and then it's just going to rot. So what they did was they grew this dwarf wheat and semi-dwarf wheat. So as they hybridized, you can see they shrank the stalk part of it, because that's not food. This stalk part is not food. So they actually shrank it down so it looks more like this. It's a little tiny mini dwarf wheat. So it's called dwarf and semi-dwarf wheat. And the thing is that it doesn't buckle, and it matures much faster. So in fact, you could grow a lot more of it and waste a lot less of the food. And so 99% of the worldwide wheat is now this wheat and not this wheat, which is what we used to eat 100 years ago, right? And the concern is that perhaps by changing our wheat, the food actually has been changed. And there is some evidence to support this. If you go back and look at broad-bulk wheat experiments. So what they've done is, since 1843, they've actually tested samples of wheat and straw. And what you can see is this. This is the grain yield, okay? So this is the amount of grain per hectare. So all through history, basically, this is till about 1960 when the Green Revolution kind of took off, you can see that you'd get a certain number of tons per hectares. That's the amount of wheat you could grow in a field. And it was fairly steady. Right around here, around 1960 or so, it kind of took off. You can see that you grow, instead of 2 or 3 tons per hectare, you went up to 6 or 7. And that's, of course, due to this dwarf and semi-dwarf wheat, because for one field, you could plant more of these things, and you're not growing the stalk, you're growing the food. So the amount of grain you get went way up. But if you look at the nutrition of this wheat, there's actually a huge difference. So this is the iron, the magnesium, the copper, and the zinc. So all these micronutrients that are in the food, you can see that there's actually a large change. So this is where we change the wheat, okay? And you can see that there's clearly a difference between the old wheat and the new wheat. That is, it seems to be far less nutritious for you. And you see the same thing. As you get more yield of wheat, it seems to have changed. Remember, 99% of the wheat that we eat is this one, right? So this is what the wheat looks like. And there's several parts. There's the endosperm, the bran, and the germ. And one of the problems is, when you go to the grocery store and you get whole wheat and white and whole wheat and whole grain, A lot of times you don't really know what you're getting. The whole wheat in Canada, as opposed to the United States, for instance, allows you to remove up to 5% of the wheat kernel. And the problem is that this endosperm is the carbohydrate part. That's the white part, right? The germ is where most of the vitamins, the proteins, the healthy fats are contained, right? So you can remove up to 5% of this whole thing, but what happens is that they take the 5% mostly out of this germ part. So you can actually remove 70% of the germ, which is all the nutritious part, and still call yourself whole wheat. And that's fine. And what they do is they often take out this because as you take out the fat and stuff, the shelf life actually increases, so it doesn't go bad. So if you ever buy whole wheat, if you ever buy bread from a real bakery, you see, of course, it hardens like in a day or a day and a half. It goes stale, but the Wonder Bread that you buy stays soft for like a week and a half. It's a difference in the processing, right? The other thing is that people often add molasses. So if you ever look on bread ingredients, often molasses in there is to darken it up, so it looks more wheaty, but it's actually not. It's actually, they just add it to color it. But it's really this part that's the problem. So you can see if you go from a whole food, which is wheat, whole grain, this is whole grain, and as you take out the bran, the middlings, the wheat germ, the oil, and this is the white flour, which is the end result, which you buy to make your cakes and stuff, you can see there's a huge difference in terms of all these kind of nutritious materials that are taken out. So while they might say that the 100% whole grain, which is this, is okay, when you get to whole wheat, you could take out, you know, most of this stuff. The problem with multigrain is, of course, that it just means that there's more grains, but it doesn't mean that they're whole grains or unrefined grains. So you have things like Pringles, which I think is really funny actually, because they think that you think it's going to be really healthy for you, these potato chips, right? Because they call themselves multigrain, which is great, except that it just means there's more grains. It doesn't mean, so you could take two highly refined grains, stick them together and call yourself multigrain. So if you look at Pringles, for instance, what you have is rice flour, dried potatoes, and corn flour, none of which is very good for you, and none of which is any better than the regular potato that you're taking in the original Pringles. But nevertheless, they stick a big multigrain symbol on it, and all of a sudden you think that your chips that you're eating are a bit healthier. They taste pretty good, but they're not any better for you. So what you really want to make sure of is that you have 100% whole grain. The other problem is the speed of digestion influences how high your sugars go. That is, this is the traditional stone grinder. And basically it was a heavy stone and they'd grind these things on. And this is the modern flour mill. And you can see this is a very high-tech machine which pulverizes the flour into a very fine dust, right? And the problem is, even if you take the whole grain and you pulverize it to a very fine dust, your body now can absorb it extremely quickly. And if it absorbs it very quickly, then it all turns into sugar, and then that's going to drive your high insulin levels. So the way that we cook 100 years ago, 150 years ago, one is that the wheat might be a bit different, but we also use these kind of traditional stone mills, so you can still buy stone ground bread, and that's probably better because it's not as refined, it's not as finely pulverized. If you look at what we eat now, which is the white flour, most of that is the endosperm part of the wheat. And if you look at what actually it is, it's mostly carbohydrate, but there's some protein in it, and it's arranged as starch. So one of the things, of course, everybody kind of knew 100 years ago was that the starchy foods are going to make you fat, right? That's, if you ever ask your grandmother, that's probably the first thing she'd say, right? Don't eat the sugar, don't eat the starchy foods. And it turns out that there's several types of starch. There's this amylopectin, which is most of what flour is, and there's this amylose, and this is what they look like. One is this branched chain of carbohydrates, and this is kind of this single chain, which is looped around. Most of it is the amylopectin, and it turns out that there's actually several types of amylopectin. So if you look at the types of amylopectin, there's actually several. So these are all starches, but they're different. So if you look at amylopectin C, you see these in legumes, which is beans. And what you find is that they're very hard to digest. There's amylopectin B, which is found in potatoes and bananas, and they're kind of intermediate. And there's amylopectin A, which is found in wheat. So wheat, of course, is the most digestible. And you can see this if you ever look at a table of glycemic index. So the glycemic index, remember, is a table of how quickly your blood sugars go up in response to food. So you can see that if you look at the legumes and amylopectin C, you can see the kidney beans, as you eat them, they're still carbohydrates, right? But they're very hard to digest. So they don't really raise your sugars. Amylopectin B, this is a Snickers bar by comparison, right? So the banana, which is kind of intermittent, is even higher than the Snickers bar, but the whole wheat bread. So even if it's a whole wheat bread, you can see that your sugars still kind of go up very high in comparison. And that high sugar, of course, is going to contribute to the high insulin levels. So as an aside, the amylopectin C, this is very hard to digest, right? So what happens to the beans, of course, a lot of it kind of makes its way undigested into the colon. The bacteria kind of start to eat this because it hasn't been because it hasn't been digested, and that's what gives you a lot of gas, right? Whenever you take the beans, and that's because it's not being digested. The food is kind of going through, and the bacteria are making the gas. So basically, what you're finding is that the amylopectin A, which is the most highly digestible starch. So it's not simply about the carbohydrates, but wheat seems to be much more efficiently converted to blood sugar than any other carbohydrate out there. Not only that, but we're also pulverizing it into very fine dust, which makes it even easier for the body to absorb, and as it absorbs it, it turns it all into sugar. The other thing, similar to sugars, is that there's actually a concern that these things are addictive. So sugars might be addictive, but wheat might also be addictive. Now, it's not clear that they are, but what we find is that the gluten, which is one of the proteins, can be digested to something called exorphins. And they actually stimulate the same receptor as morphine. So because wheat is the predominant source of these glutens, it's possible that the wheat that you eat gets digested and turns into these exorphins, and it crosses the blood-brain barrier, and it's possible that these things are addictive. So a lot of people think that. The actual scientific evidence is kind of sketchy, but really, if you think about it a little bit, it's certainly possible. Because if you think about all these comfort foods are so called because they give us comfort, right? So it makes us feel better to eat them. But they all tend to be very, very starchy. They're also sugary, but they're also very starchy. So all these things like, a big plate of mac and cheese kind of thing, right? A big plate of pasta. You hear this all the time, I'm addicted to bread, right? I'm addicted to pasta. And, most people think that's like, just a figure of speech. But it's possible that there actually is some mild addictive-like potential. Because there are always stories of people who are on wheat and they say, oh, I stopped the wheat, and it's like, oh man, I couldn't, I had these cravings and I couldn't stop. Those are all hallmarks of addiction. If you think about what people say, oh, I'm addicted to, bread, I'm addicted to pasta, but nobody ever says I'm addicted to like spinach or I'm addicted to like beef, right? It just doesn't happen, right? So it's certainly possible that the sugars as well as these carbohydrates might actually be addictive. Not in the sense that, a heavy addiction, but certainly they may make you crave them more. So in summary, there's actually a number of problems with the wheat as it is. One, it's possible that the wheat that we eat is currently quite different than the wheat that we used to eat. The processing of our wheat is actually much different as well. So before, where they used to take the whole grain and put it into these traditional stone grinders, now what we do is remove all the kind of nutritious part of it, and we take the kind of white part of it and we pulverize it into a very fine dust. So the modern milling, the modern processing is actually quite different. The modern milling is quite different. And the other thing is, in comparison to other carbohydrates, it tends to be this highly digestible amylopectin A, which is the worst for you, and they might be addictive. So Dr. William Davis wrote a whole book about this called Wheat Belly, and what he says is that this is, this kind of big belly that you see, which, is the same as a beer belly, might be actually all from the wheat. And there's a lot of good reasons why you might think that the wheat is particularly bad. In China, of course, the main carbohydrate used to be rice, and is for the most part. And rice doesn't share these same kind of concerns. So even though it is also a refined carbohydrate, and as opposed to kind of brown rice, the white rice has also had the hull taken off, and it tends to raise the blood sugars quite high, but it doesn't have some of these other problems. What you find is that this doctor, Dr. T. Colin Campbell, he did a study called the China study, where he went to China, and basically he just listed all the foods that they were eating. And what they found is that if you look at BMI, which is a measure of your obesity, that is a measure of weight, compared to how much wheat you take in, you can see that there's a correlation. As each groups of Chinese people were eating more wheat, there was more obesity. You can see that the curve goes like this. But you can also see the same thing for coronary heart disease. That is, not only is it impacting the weight, but also the heart disease. So as you take more wheat, there's clearly a correlation that they are going to get more mortality. So if you think about the Asian conundrum, right, this was one of the major sticking points in the whole carbohydrate hypothesis, was that people would say, well, if carbohydrates were so bad for you, so in the 60s and 70s, there was a debate whether it was the fat that was really killing you or whether it was the carbohydrates. And some people said it was the carbohydrates and some people said it was the fats. And one of the things that they always said was that, well, if it's the carbohydrates that are really bad for you, let's look at the Chinese and the Japanese. Their carbohydrate intakes are basically off the charts compared to United States and United Kingdom. But yet they had very little obesity and very little of, diabetes, heart disease, the whole thing, right? So they're eating a lot of rice and very little sugar. But because of how much rice they eat, it was very high. But the thing about it is that if you think about it from this framework, what you can see is that they weren't eating the wheat, which is considerably worse than the rice, and they weren't eating the fructose. So even though that they were eating a lot of these carbohydrates, they weren't causing all this insulin resistance. When you take a lot of carbohydrates, but you take a lot of wheat, which is like you can consider it a super carbohydrate, and you take a lot of fructose, what you get is a lot of insulin resistance and a lot of insulin. And this will drive each other. If you're not taking any of the sugars, well, then you get very little resistance. So even if you're taking a lot of rice, it didn't seem to matter. And I think that's how you can understand why all those Asian cultures didn't get diabetes. But what's happened now? As you westernize their diets, so in China this is happening. In Japan it happened kind of 10 years ago. But in China, because it was kind of behind Japan, it's actually also started to westernize its diet. So instead of taking a traditional rice-based diet, and you see this in also India and Pakistan and all these other Asian countries, right? As you change from a rice-based diet with very little sugar, as you become more westernized, one of the things that people start to eat is more sugar and more flour. And those are the main problems, the flour and the sugar. So whereas before you'd go to, in Japan and China, you'd go there and you wouldn't see like bakeries, right? Like bakeries that you see here, because everybody ate rice-based diet, right? Nobody's eating these cakes and cookies and breads. But now you go to places like Japan and there's bakeries all over the place, right? So they've become more westernized, and as you westernize, you get these two particular foods which are particularly insidious. So it doesn't matter what ethnic background you are. As you move, if you take the Japanese or the Chinese and you move them to Toronto, their diet suddenly becomes less rice-based because there's all these other things, right? There's great bakeries and there's these pastries and there's donuts and there's Tim Hortons, right? So you eat the muffin and you eat the scones and you eat their donuts and, you know, all this other sort of stuff, and you turn from a rice-based diet into one of these wheat and sugar-based diets. Yeah, maybe you're right, you're still taking your rice, but this is the problem. And you see that exact same thing, because if you look at migrant studies, if you take people out of, you know, Japan and Pakistan and Guyana and places like this and move them to North America, within several generations you start to see these problems. So here's the real problem that we have. How are we going to break this cycle? Because this, I think, is the major problem. The increased insulin levels and the insulin resistance. That's really at the center of all our problems in terms of the obesity, the diabetes, the high blood pressure, the high cholesterol, and the fatty liver. How are we going to do that? What we need to do is really reduce the insulin levels, right? So you can do all this. You can reduce your proteins, your carbohydrates, your wheat, your fructose, but if this is just feeding itself in a vicious cycle, it's still not going to work very well. So how are we going to really do that? And really, the answer is fasting. So fasting is not really a new idea. It's really a very old idea. And I put this up because this is a comic book called Asterix. I used to love this as a kid. So this is the chief vital statistic. So he's fat and he has a fatty liver. So this is set in the ancient Roman times. And the first thing they did was they sent them to one of these Roman spas. And of course what they do is they take spas, which is, you know, baths and stuff, to reduce the stress levels. But the other thing they do is fasting. So, you know, basically they weren't giving him anything to eat, so he's all sad. But that's what it is. And it's an idea that's been really around for a long, long time. If you look at the ancient Greeks, so this is, you know, several thousand years BC, you can see that Hippocrates, really considered the father of modern medicine, was saying, our food should be our medicine should be our food. But to eat when you are sick is to feed your sickness. Okay, so he was actually a great believer in the power of fasting. Now, the reason we don't fast is because there's a lot of myths out there about how bad it is for you. So there are things like it puts the body into starvation mode, it depletes the body of nutrients, most of your weight loss is going to be from muscle or water. That's one of the things that always gets put out there. It causes hypoglycemia or low blood sugars, and it causes this kind of yo-yo dieting. Really, that's not really the case, but mostly as soon as you talk about fasting, people say, oh, it's crazy. In fact, people say that to me all the time. You're crazy. Because it's not an idea that has really been around for, like, we've kind of forgotten about it in the last 30, 40 years. But you got to realize that almost every single major religion in the world has used fasting. So if you look at the Buddhists, if you look at the Catholics, if you look at the Muslims, if you look at almost any religious group, they always have incorporated fasting. If you look at Lent, you know, 40 days of Lent or Ramadan, you know, there's always fasting incorporated in any major religion. And it's not because they thought it was so bad for you. It's because they knew that there was something about it which was very good for you, that it would keep people healthy and would make them healthy. Maybe spiritually, but also physically. They would be healthier from fasting. And one of the things that people always worry about is that they're going to be hungry all the time. And back in the 60s, when people were still using fasting as a method of weight control, they would do these studies on fasting. And every time they did the study, they were always surprised. And I put a few of these quotes here. They said, well, the most astonishing aspect of this study was the ease with which prolonged starvation was tolerated. That is, people weren't actually all that hungry when they were fasting. A sense of well-being was associated with the fast. So not only weren't they not hungry, but they were actually feeling better than they used to. So they would fast people from 12 to 117 days. The other thing that people always said is that you're going to overeat. It's going to cause this yo-yo dieting as you fast. That actually doesn't really happen. Because if you look, and this was done in 2002, they looked at how many calories you ate the day after a fast. So a regular day was 2,436 calories. And the day after it went up to 2,914 calories. So yes, you did eat a little bit more. But if you take your total calories for the 2 days, On a regular diet, it'd be 48-72. When you fast one day and eat the regular day, you eat a bit more the next day, but not nearly enough to compensate for what you did on your fasting day. So you're 29-14, so a net deficit of almost 2,000 calories. So yeah, you do eat a bit more, but not nearly as much as you think you will. And you will be a bit hungry, but not nearly as much as you think you will. In fact, this was actually the world record. He was in the Guinness Book of World Records for some time. He actually was, he fasted for 382 days, so more than a year he fasted. And they thought this was so interesting, they actually followed him, they checked his blood work to make sure he wasn't killing himself, and his weight went from 456 to 180 pounds, and he said he felt great. In fact, he was actually put on a fast initially for weight loss. But he said he felt so great he just kept going. So then they kept monitoring him, and this is the thing that people worry about, is that, well, you're going to be depleted of all these nutrients. Well, they measured all his electrolytes and everything, and there was no problem. So the blood sugar goes down, but then it doesn't go down so far as to give you low blood sugars. Okay? It goes down, but then it just stays down, and it doesn't kind of keep going down. Remember, this guy fasted for more than a year. Your calcium, your phosphorus, all these other electrolytes, they go up, they go down, but in general, at the end, they're about the same as when they started. So even after a whole year, you can see that there really is no problem with the fasting in terms of the electrolytes. One of the main things that you see is that the plasma insulin goes down. And that makes sense because insulin is a hormone that is released, you know, because of the food, right? It's to digest the food. If you're not eating, your plasma insulin levels are going to go down. So while glucose remains in the normal limits, the insulin level goes down significantly. If you look at what else happens, the insulin goes down, but the growth hormone also goes up, which is very interesting, and we'll talk about in a bit. But the major reason that we're interested in this, in terms of treatment of diabetes, treatment of obesity, is that the fasting really reduces the plasma insulin level. So again, you can take these people and put them on a fast for several days, and what you see is that immediately the insulin level goes down. The other thing that is interesting is that if you measure free fatty acid levels, they actually go up. That's actually a good thing, because what's happening is that your body is now turning from burning glucose, because you're not taking any sugars in, and it's switched over to burning fat. Basically, what's happening is that your body has started to digest its own fat. So fat is basically food that is stored, on your body for a time that you're not going to eat. If you're eating, what the body says is that, well, I have plenty of food, so I don't need to touch it. But as soon as you stop eating, the body is now forced to start burning fat, and that's what you see. The free fatty acids go up. So that's great. One of the problems with, and we talked about this earlier, with most diets, the way conventional diets go, which is just to reduce a certain number of calories per day, is that the resting metabolic rate goes down, right? So if you try and lower the amount of calories you take, what happens is that your weight goes down, but then, as everybody knows, it goes back up. And one of the problems when you measure your resting metabolic rate is that your body starts to slowly shut down. So if you remember those studies from where they starved people and measured their resting metabolic rates, it can go down like 30–40%. That is, if you normally take 2,000 calories a day and you burn 2,000 calories a day, you're kind of not gaining weight, you're not losing weight, right? So you're like equal. As you reduce your calories in to like 1,500 and you're burning 2,000, you'll lose a bit of weight. But what happens over time is that your body actually reduces its energy expenditure so that you're only burning 1,500. So then now, even though you're eating less, you're not losing any weight. And remember, what happens is that it starts to make your body hungry, it starts to lower your energy expenditure to regain that weight. But if you look at what happens during a fast, the body never really gets a chance to get used to that lower level of calories. So this is a alternate daily fasting. So what they did was they took people, one day they're fasting, and then the next day they're going to eat regular, then they're going to fast again. So the weight slowly goes down over, this is about 22 days. But if you look at the resting metabolic rate, you can see that this is the kilojoules per day. So that's basically the energy you're burning in a day. It doesn't change. So it goes from 6,600 to 6,300. There's no change. The fat oxidation goes from 64 to 101, which is great. So right now, what you can measure is that you've changed over to burning fat. And your carbohydrate oxidation went from 175 to 81, which means you're not burning sugar. You're burning fat. But the body doesn't start to ratchet down its metabolism, which is always the problem with most other diets. And that's why most other diets don't work, because your body eventually gets used to it. Remember that the body is able to get used to a lot of stuff, right? So if you are in a dark room, for instance, and you go out into the light, when you go out at first it seems very bright, but then when you're in a bright, outside for a while, it just seems to be normal. It's the same thing. The body gets used to it very quickly. So if you are eating 2,000 calories a day and then you change to 1,500 calories a day, so you've reduced the amount you eat, your body says, oh, I'm getting less calories in. I need to put less calories out, because otherwise I'm going to die, right? You can't go down from 2,000 to 1,500 and keep burning 2,000. Like, that's what everybody thinks, is that, oh, I'm down 500 calories a day, and every week I'll lose a pound. Does that mean in 200 days you'll be at 0 pounds? No, of course not. That doesn't even make any sense. It can't happen. Therefore, at some point, for sure the body is just simply reducing the calories expended. But that doesn't happen when you fast. It stays up. And the important thing for diabetics is that the insulin sensitivity is much better. So if you look at, again, healthy men and they put them on this intermittent fasting, you can see that the amount of glucose, this is glucose infusion rate, which is a measure of insulin resistance, by the end of 14 days there's actually a significant difference in the insulin sensitivity. That is, your body is much more sensitive to insulin. And remember, the key thing about diabetes is that it's all about the insulin resistance. That's what diabetes is. Your body is resistant to the effect of insulin. So here's a way that we can actually reverse some of that. In other words, you can actually reverse some of the problems with diabetes. And here's why people actually sometimes feel a lot better on the fasting than they do non-fasting. It's because the norepinephrine goes up. So if you look at energy expenditure, again, this is a 4-day fast. At the beginning, your resting energy expenditure is 3.97. At the end, it's 4.4. So again, you can see that the metabolism hasn't slowed at all. It's actually maintained. And that's what people always say, oh, you're going to slow down your metabolism. You don't. When you eat less calories, you will slow down your metabolism, but you won't when you fast. But the norepinephrine levels, which is the adrenaline levels, actually significantly go up. So 1,716 on day 1, and it goes to 3,728 by day 4. In other words, your adrenaline level is shooting through the roof, which is going to give you not less energy as you fast, it's going to give you more energy. So people often feel better when they're fasting. Again, if you look at insulin levels, went from 71 to 59, so that's good. If you look at glucose, it stayed stable, it went down, but the fatty acids went from 240 to 1135, which means that you're burning fat. You're releasing these fatty acids to burn. Yeah, Leonard?
When you're on the diet, you're taking in less calories. Your calories reduce, so your energy expenditure.
Yeah. So as you take on regular diets where you just reduce your calories, so you start here, they're equal because you're not gaining or losing weight. As you reduce your calories you take in, at first you'll lose weight, but then your energy expenditure also moves down to match it. So then at the end you're not losing weight, not gaining weight.
When you're fasting, are you also reducing calories you're taking in?
You're reducing your calories you're taking in, but your energy expenditure doesn't move. It doesn't change.
That's what I don't understand.
because you're not doing it all because what's happening is that when you, and I think it's actually an evolutionary thing. Think back to the caveman. If you were not eating for a couple of days, and all of a sudden you're feeling weak and tired, you'd kind of like never eat again, because if you can't go out and catch the rabbit or catch the whatever, right? So what the body does is that it doesn't reduce the metabolism. It maintains the metabolism, but actually gives you a lot more energy. Because if you haven't eaten for 2 or 3 days, you need more energy to go out and get some food. So the body starts to burn this fat, it maintains its metabolism, and gives you more energy to go out and get the food. So in the chronic situation, where you're just simply reducing your calories every day, the body says, well, I better get used to this lower level of calories, because I need to maintain it. Right? It's just like, if you remember the analogy of the manager of a coal-fired plant, right? If you manage a coal power plant and you get 100 tons of coal a day and you put out a certain number of energy, all of a sudden the shipments of coal, which is the energy, drop from 100 tons to 50 tons. Are you still going to burn 100 tons a day? No. Soon your stores are going to run out, and then you're going to get fired because you have nothing left. What you're going to do is, if you only have 50 tons a day, then you just burn 50 tons. Actually, you might burn a little bit less, so that you start to rebuild your stores, because you're saying, oh, and that's what your body does. Your body says, well, I'm not getting as many calories, so therefore I should burn less calories. But if you do the fasting, for the first few days, your body doesn't do that. And if you alternate them, so the regimens that have been studied are alternate daily fasting, so it's one day you're going to eat, one day you're not going to eat, your body never gets a chance to adjust to the lower level of calories. So it's going to maintain your energy expenditure. The other thing that's very interesting, actually we'll just move on, we'll take questions at the end, is that the fasting also increases growth hormone. So growth hormone actually normally declines as you age. But you can see that on a day, this is the growth hormone levels. And as you go from day 1 to day 5, your growth hormone levels are actually significantly increased. And the effects of the growth hormone are these. It increases the availability and utilization of fat. So basically it helps use some of the fats. The growth hormone has a lot of other effects as well, which is promotion of the lean muscle mass and loss of fat muscle. So it preserves the muscle mass and causes fat muscle loss. You can actually do that when you give growth hormone artificially, but it hasn't been used for other reasons. And here's the most interesting thing. This is a comparison of intermittent energy restriction and continuous energy restriction. That is, should you reduce your calories a little bit every day, or should you reduce it a lot one day and then not at all? So they actually compared this in a study. So in one group, it would be the same number of calories total that they take overall. Over the week, it's the same number of calories. But one group would reduce their calories, 25% each day, and the other group would be fasting one day and then nothing. But in the end, it was the same number of calories. And what you can see is that the weight, so that's the continuous energy restriction. The IER is intermittent energy restriction. And what you see is that you start to get better weight loss in terms of the fasting protocols. The body fat tends to go down a bit more. The waist tends to go down even more, because the waist, of course, is a measure of the fat. You're preserving your lean muscle and burning the fat. But if you look at the insulin sensitivity, you see that there's actually a fair amount of difference. So insulin sensitivity, this is a measure of the insulin resistance, which is the diabetes. You can see when you restrict calories every day, it doesn't make your body any more sensitive to the insulin. But over time, what happens with the fasting protocols is that you get this steady reduction in HOMA, which means you're steadily getting more sensitive to the insulin. So if you look at insulin levels, this is the everyday restriction of calories. So the insulin levels come down a little bit, but they come down far more when you do it in an intermittent fashion, as opposed to a continuous fashion. That is, the total number of calories are still the same in both groups. But when you restrict it a lot one day and then not so much the next day, you get better results in terms of the insulin. And this is what we're really interested in, right? Because it's the insulin which is going to drive everything else, the diabetes as well as the obesity. And the key is that the lean muscle mass, which is your bones and your muscle, are preserved, as opposed to regular weight loss. Like the dirty little secret of most weight loss programs where they restrict calories is that half of that is fat, but half of that is actually muscle and bone that you're losing. The weight that you lose, half of it is muscle and bone. And then when you go off of your diet, because most people do, you regain all fat, which is why they say there's problems with these yo-yo diets, because if you lose 10 kilos as, 5 kilos of fat, 5 kilos of muscle and bone, and then you regain 10 kilos, that 10 kilos was all fat. So you're actually worse off than you were before. And that's the problem with these yo-yo diets. But that doesn't happen when you do it in an intermittent fashion, because if you do the fasting, if you look at the fat, the body weight, so again, this is over about 70 days of alternate daily fasting, so fasting one day and then eating one day, what you see is that the weight steadily goes down from 96 kilos to 90.8 kilos. But if you look at the fat mass, it goes from 43 down to 38, but the fat-free mass goes from 52 to 51.9, which means that you're burning all pure fat, as opposed to losing bone and losing muscle, which you see with some of these other things. If you look at other measures, such as the cholesterol, you can see that over 70 days of this alternate daily fast, your total cholesterol goes down. This is 0. Your LDL, your bad cholesterol, goes down. Your good cholesterol doesn't really go down, and your triglycerides goes down. So those are all beneficial effects. And this is really what we see, is that you can break the cycle of insulin resistance with fasting. And this is really where it starts to get exciting for people with diabetes, because insulin resistance is really diabetes. So if you can use fasting to break that cycle, the question is, can you use it to treat diabetes? Diabetes, of course, is a very bad disease, as you all know, and if you look at how much diabetes there is, it's been going up. It's kind of been exploding, along with obesity, because they're really caused by the same thing. If you think about obesity and diabetes, they're both really caused by insulin. Insulin drives obesity, but insulin drives insulin resistance. So in other words, insulin causes both obesity and diabetes. So if you look at studies of fasting, you can see that there actually is a significant benefit of fasting for diabetes. Because if you look at the caloric restriction, so this is fasting, if you look at the weight loss, this is a 1-day fast, this is a 5-day fast, and this is a standard diet. You can see that the weight goes down. But if you look at how well people's sugars are controlled, you can see that compared to a standard diet, the fasting protocols do much, much better. There's about a 5-6% response rate here, and this is about 25%. The 5-day fast is like close to 40%. So in fact, this seems to be, as opposed to a standard diet, which is basically they tell you, oh, just eat a little bit less. That's what they all tell you, right? Eat a little bit less. It doesn't really work. It doesn't really work because it doesn't, it continuously restricts the energy, rather than being in an intermittent fashion. The key is the timing. So in terms of what to eat, yes, I agree with a lot of what they say. You shouldn't eat sugar. A lot of the people are turning against wheat as well, and that's correct. But it doesn't address the timing of the meals. It's the timing that is equally important. If you look at studies of fasting and coronary heart disease, you can see that in this group, what they did was they took a group of Mormons who, for religious reasons, fast 1 day a month. And they looked at them in terms of how much heart disease they have, and they said that they found that that's actually the strongest predictor of whether or not they have diabetes and heart disease. So if you look at the fasting group versus the non-fasting group, they have for the same age and the same body weight, they have far less diabetes and far less heart disease as well. So the fasting does seem to have a lot of benefits. And if you look historically back at what happened during food rationing, So food rationing happened during the war. So you can see that during the war, the World War I and World War II, a lot of the flour and the sugars were rationed. And you can see that this is the diabetes mortality. So it has been going up, and then during the war it kind of plummets. It goes way down because they're not eating any of this stuff. And then in between the war it's okay, and then as you get to World War II, the same thing happens. It just plummets. It just goes way down. So there seems to be a beneficial effect to this restriction. And the truth about the diabetes is that it's actually a reversible disease. That is, in contrast to what most people have told you, they say that diabetes is a chronic disease. It's something you're always going to have. You have to live with it for the rest of your life. But that's not actually true, because if you get rid of if you can break that cycle, you can get rid of the diabetes. And in fact, when they study people, so this is where they put people on very low-calorie diets, what you see is that the sugars go way down, and then the hepatic triglycerides, which is the fatty liver, goes down, and how much glucose production, which is a measure of the insulin resistance, also goes down. But these changes that happen in the body, that is, the changes of diabetes, are not permanent. They're actually reversible. But you can't be reversed by the way we treat people now. Think about how we treat people now, which is we give them more insulin and more insulin and more insulin. Well, if insulin is the problem, if insulin is causing the insulin resistance and insulin is causing the obesity, then it's simply going to make the problem worse, not better. Because insulin is the problem. So insulin can't be the solution. But yet that's what we think about as the solution to diabetes, giving more and more insulin. And most of you have thought about this when you take insulin. You always say, patients always say, well, you're giving me insulin for the diabetes and it's going to make me better. But insulin is making me gain 20, 30, 40 pounds. So how is that good? If you're telling me to lose weight, but you're giving me insulin, which is making me gain weight. And of course, your doctor really doesn't have a good answer to that. They're kind of like, oh, well, that's just life, that's just the way it is. But it's not, because the insulin was actually making it worse. And you know it was making it worse because it was making you gain all that weight. Insulin was causing all the problems. And if you look at surgical treatments for diabetes, so this is stomach stapling, so this is a sleeve gastrectomy. So they basically cut your stomach, a Roux-en-Y gastric bypass, so they cut your stomach to the size of a walnut. Basically, you can't eat. And what happened was that there was a 90% cure rate for diabetes. So the main point is not to tell you to have these surgeries. The main point is that diabetes is not a permanent condition. It can reverse, but you have to treat it the right way, which is you need to reduce the insulin levels to very low levels to break that cycle. And that's exactly what these surgical treatments do. These surgical treatments, basically, you can't eat. So basically, they're forcing you to fast. But if fasting is what's causing all the benefits, why do you need to do the surgery at all? And the truth is that you don't. You just have to be able to maintain your fast. The surgery, of course, makes sure you fast because you can't eat. Your stomach's the size of a walnut. You eat, you throw up. You eat, you throw up. So basically, you're fasting. But that's all it is. Why do you need to do the surgery to do that? And if you look at the number of diabetic medications and the change in weight when you do these surgeries, okay, so you go from about 3 medications of diabetes a day to virtually 0 by 12 months. And medical therapy doesn't do anything of the sort. So intensive medical therapy doesn't make you any better. That is, taking these drugs which increase your insulin levels doesn't do a damn thing for your diabetes. Your diabetes is just as bad 12 months ago than it was here. You've never gotten better. Here you know that you've gotten better because you're taking less medications. The weight, of course, doesn't change with intensive medical therapy, but it changes a lot with the surgical things. But basically, it's a surgically enforced fast. So if you think about how to cure diabetes now, you can actually cure the diabetes. The problem is this. I've replaced this increased insulin levels causes insulin resistance. But insulin resistance is basically diabetes. So this is the problem here, and I've taken out the other stuff. But this is the problem. Both the increased insulin levels are going to cause the diabetes, and the fructose can also cause insulin resistance, which is the diabetes. But the fasting works at this level to break the insulin, so it drives down your insulin levels to very low levels, which is going to result in less diabetes. The other thing is that the fasting is going to work here as well, because if you're not drinking like sugar-sweetened beverages and not eating a lot of processed foods which contain a lot of sugar, it's going to work there as well. So if you break this and you break this, then your diabetes has no choice but to get better. And the thing is that it's not too late. It's never too late. You can do this at basically any time, because all those patients that they did the surgery on were the worst patients they've had. That's why they did the surgery, because they were like 360 pounds, 400 pounds, and had diabetes. So they're very bad diabetics. But even the worst diabetic there, they could still reverse the diabetes almost completely. And this is how they did it. They did surgery to make sure you're fasting, either by putting a band or cutting your stomach or whatever it is. But the magic was really in the fasting. That was where everything happens. It's basically by doing the fasting, you're doing the bariatric surgery without doing the surgery. So the question is, can we cure the diabetes? And really, if you think about it, the implications are like enormous. Like the diabetes is a bad disease. I mean, you got the kidney disease, you got the foot ulcers, you got the blindness. It's the leading cause of blindness, the leading cause of kidney disease. It causes heart attacks, it causes strokes, all of it, right? But if you don't take care of the diabetes, you'll never take care of the eye problems or the kidney problems, because the diabetes is causing all those problems. The only way you can take care of all those problems is actually to get rid of the diabetes. But people have always said that you can't get rid of the diabetes, but that's really not true. You can't get rid of it the way they're treating it now, which is give you more insulin, more insulin, more insulin. That's not going to do anything for you. That's just going to make you worse. And you know it's worse because every year you need a little bit more insulin, right? You start with metformin, then you take a little bit more medication, then a bit more, and pretty soon you're on insulin, then you're on a bit more insulin, then you're a bit more insulin. So you know that over those years that you're just getting worse. And the thing about this is that as opposed to anything else, as opposed to any other treatments for diabetes, there's no drugs. There's no surgery, and there's no cost. Right? You don't have to take any fancy drugs. In fact, you're going to take less drugs than you ever did. There's no surgery, so there's really no side effects of the surgery, and you can reverse it at any time. If you decide you don't want to fast for a couple of days because you have a big celebration, you don't. But then when you're done, you just go back to it. There's no surgery. There's nothing irreversible about this. If you do bariatric surgery, which is stapling your stomach, if you go out and decide, oh, you want to have a big celebration, you have a big wedding, you still can't eat. You eat, you throw up. You eat, you throw up. That's what happens, right? Your stomach's this big. With fasting, you can eat whatever you want that day, right? Then the next day you'll just fast. There's nothing irreversible about the whole process. So there's no long-term side effects. So I think you could actually do a 6 to 12 month process of intensive fasting or intensive dietary management and just cure the whole diabetes. It's not easy, but it's not the hardest thing either. And in fact, it's using not a newfangled treatment, but an extremely old treatment. One that we've always known has been effective, but we've always forgotten about. And that's where I'm going to finish things. You can turn that off. I think that what we need to